Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Marcus Gadson, the author of Sedition: How America's Constitutional Order Emerged from Violent Crisis. He's a professor of law at Campbell University and has been published in the UCLA Law Review and the Georgetown Law Journal. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Gadson.
It's great to be with you.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. No matter which side of the many sides of a debate that someone is on in this country, one of the laws of America seems to be that the sides arguing all believe the Constitution is on their side, whether it's over abortion, guns, the right to vote, the right to collect taxes, or the right to not pay taxes, the right to storm the Capitol, or to stop people from storming the Capitol. The argument always begins with the Constitution said I have a right to do that. Mr. Gadson, I first want to ask, is that the sign of a healthy Constitution, that everyone can find something in it for them?
Well, actually, yes and no. So let me talk about why that is actually, in a way, a sign of health. And so one of the things we need to realize is that America is an incredibly diverse country, and it has been an incredibly diverse country since the founding. And one of the challenges you face in drafting a constitution is how do you get something that people from very different walks of life and very different worldviews can support. At the founding, that looked like how do we get New England Puritans and Virginia Cavaliers and Pennsylvania Quakers? How do we all get them to sign onto the same Constitution? So the fact that all of them were able to walk away with something that they valued in the Constitution is an extraordinary achievement, as is the fact that it has endured for more than 200 years. The reason why I have some hesitation and why part of the answer I think is no is because I think if you really value the Constitution, then one of the things you should do is when you have a policy dispute, you should begin with the question of, does the Constitution allow us to do X, Y, or Z, instead of how can I use the Constitution to justify doing X, Y, and Z? And that may seem like a subtle distinction, but one of those approaches is looking at the Constitution the way a thoughtful judge would, where they're really trying to understand what the Constitution means and use it to guide their decision making. The other way is using it as a lawyer, where you're trying to win a case for your client and you're picking out whatever provision you need to emphasize. And that can quickly become unhealthy because it suggests then that the Constitution is nothing more than a tool.
Anybody can write a constitution. The key is enforcing the constitution, and the means to enforce the constitution. You have to be able to say the people who the constitution applies to have a desire to live alongside the other people the constitution applies to. So have you been able to figure out whether the enforcement, the threat of enforcement comes first, or if the belief in the constitution comes first?
Oh, that's a really interesting chicken and egg situation.
Right.
So I write as a legal scholar and with a historical lens. And one of the things you're really asking about is legitimacy, I think. In other words, how do we understand whether or not a constitution is legitimate? Is it that people have bought in before, or is it that the force of the government is on the side of the constitution and that then makes them obey? And it is actually a little bit of both. Um, and at the founding, one of the most important historical developments that I think doesn't always get emphasized today is the fact that George Washington appears at the Philadelphia Convention, and that has an extraordinary legitimating impact on Americans. We don't actually have a political figure like George Washington today, where the idea is no matter where in the country you come from, if he tells you to jump, you jump. And so if he tells you to ratify the Constitution, then you think very long and hard about whether you oppose the Constitution or not. And so that actually built up a lot of legitimacy, just having him there. and supporting the Constitution. But then, actually, one of the things that ends up boosting the legitimacy of the US Constitution early on in its history is it is able to survive a lot of unrest. And so I'll give you one example would be the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s, where people see, oh, the federal government is able to deal with people rebelling against its authority and it can survive. And that gives people more confidence in the structure of the federal government.
The word sedition is written in red across your tan colored book. It's a very kind of bold faced title to your book. What, how do we, let's define the term. How do we define the term sedition, and when does disagreement become sedition?
This is actually a terrific question, and it ties in with a lot of arguments we're now having as a country. And so I think of sedition alongside other terms like insurrection and rebellion and treason as terms that have uh, both a meaning that I think can be commonly used in society where the meaning stretches, and then also a more legal, technical meaning. And so when I see sedition, I'm thinking about people that are rebelling against government authority. And so what that means is it's not sedition to criticize the government. It's not sedition to criticize the president. It's not sedition to say you disagree. It's not even sedition actually to use harsh language against the government. What is sedition, or what is some of these other terms, is when you take the step of starting to actually rebel against the government in some way. And so I think that that's an important distinction to make between that and ordinary criticism of the government, because we do have a First Amendment in this country. And so it is very important that people are able to criticize the government.
And so, what's the tangible aspect of rebellion? When does, as you say, harsh language or, um, basic protesting, when does that tangibly turn into a rebellion?
I think the easiest paradigm is when people start at the founding getting out pitchforks and muskets and trying to attack the government, or today when people start assassinating or attempting to assassinate government officials or storming the Capitol to try to overturn an election result. Those are the easy cases
Hmm.
where you have crossed the line into something that more resembles sedition or insurrection or rebellion. Uh, However, I totally realize that you could make the argument that some civil rights protests are rebellions in the sense of they are doing sit-ins, they are disobeying the law. But I think you and I probably both share the intuition that there's a difference between that, where they're being peaceful, they're accepting the consequences, they're not trying to hurt the people that are enforcing the law. But sure, somebody could make the argument that that too is a form of, rebellion against the government.
And then it gets to the whole point, which I have questions about, so you don't have to answer it now, but it gets to the whole point of what are you rebelling for and what are you trying to make change for? I first want to ask, though, we spend so much time talking about the ways that the king, going back here to the 1770s, the way the king of England um, angered the colonists and how that sort of rooted the beginning of the new, what would become the new country. Um, the Then we talk about the attempts to write the Declaration of Independence and then the attempts to write the Constitution, and we kind of root that in the behavior of the king. But what about the war? Your book talks about violence. How does the Constitution reflect the violence of the Revolutionary War? Can we find the roots of the violence in there?
In terms of making the US Constitution,
Exactly, yeah.
well, so I would say a couple of things about that. One is that violence in the American Revolution is a prerequisite to having a United States where you could have a constitution. So it's only the fact that we've secured our independence from England that allows us to write a constitution in the first place. And so you could say, actually, and I'm sure if you could talk to King George III and bring him to 2025, he would probably observe the irony that you have a constitution protecting against rebellion and insurrection because you successfully engaged in rebellion against my authority. So there's that angle. But actually, one of the things I would do too is I would talk a little bit about how concerns about violence in the 1780s actually were a one of the motivating factors in writing the U.S. Constitution. And so after we defeat England, there's kind of this, maybe elementary school version of history that's like we did that and then we progressed right to the U.S. Constitution and Ben Franklin, came out and waved it around and said we had a republic if we could keep it. What that's missing is that the 1780s are a time of great political unrest and great political violence. And one of the examples of that is Shays' Rebellion, where you have people closing courthouses at gunpoint in Massachusetts, and you have really a rebel militia that the government of Massachusetts isn't able to combat successfully. And that is something that horrifies the founding fathers. There's correspondence about it between the founding fathers, and they're saying we've got to have a stronger centralized government so that we can prevent instability and violence like this at the state level. And so the US Constitution, even in its original form, was in part intended as a check against some of these violent tendencies and impulses that you saw. And one of the other ironies I think you might observe if you were King George III is that if you were an American patriot, not only did you rebel, but you had to legitimate violence in order to justify what you did in the American Revolution, right? We have to say that we pledge our lives, fortunes, and honor, and we're justified in putting on military uniforms and shooting at British soldiers. Well, King George III might have made the observation that that impulse doesn't die easily. So, in other words, once you start down the road of saying that sometimes it is acceptable to engage in violence to try to redress political grievances, that's just a change in your culture that's going to have long-lasting implications. And I raise this because Daniel Shays and the people that were part of his militia, they wouldn't have told you that they were trying to undermine the American project or that they weren't loyal Americans. In fact, they would have said that they were continuing the American Revolution, that they were the heirs of the American Revolution. And so that is a difficult tension our founding fathers have to try to wrestle with, which is on one hand, we all believe that we are justified in using violence against the English, but we can't go on that way as a country. A country can't function if we just have Shays rebellions every day. So how do we navigate that tension?
One of the things that you say is that the Constitution holding us together is just as relevant as the way it's torn us apart. How did you arrive at that thesis?
I think one of the things that helped me see that is as a student of American history, one of the things that stands out to me is that very different Americans have been able to say how much they love the US Constitution. And so, to give you an example of that, Frederick Douglass would tell you that he loves the founding fathers and he loves the US Constitution and he deeply believes in the ideals of the US Constitution. And I believe him, by the way. He gives a speech. It's called, What to the Negro? What is July 4th to the Negro? And he really goes into his reverence for the founding fathers and the US Constitution. On the other hand, you had many Southern slaveholders who also would have told you they revered General Washington and they revered the founding fathers. And so then that raises the question for me, how can two people who are on two diametrically opposed ends of a very divisive issue, slavery, both say that they respect the US Constitution? And I don't actually know that I have the greatest explanation for that other than to say that it is true. It is a fact of American history that it has been able to get the respect of very different Americans. And so that is a central tension in American history is you have people with very different worldviews all respecting the same Constitution at the federal level. But then at the state level, which is something I also talk about a lot in my book, you have constitutions that were not able to successfully appeal to both former slaves and former slaveholders. That's, for one example, South Carolina, where you have a constitution that specifically promotes slavery, that actually limits participation to whites. And then you have a rewritten version of that constitution that guarantees Black equality explicitly in a way that the US Constitution didn't early on in its history. And that ended up being a constitution where you just couldn't get people with two very different worldviews to support it. And I think that's an interesting fact of American history, too, is that sometimes we have state constitutions that aren't able to get respect across the spectrum.
And we almost never talk about state constitutions. I cover state government, and maybe the only place I ever see the state constitution even mentioned is at the top of the Florida Capitol, where there's the first passage of it that's kind of at the top of the ring that goes around the main entryway. But otherwise, there's very little discussion of state constitutions. When did you kind of stumble on, wait a minute, this is a key friction point?
Well, I first got interested in state constitutions actually was back in 2013. I was doing a student research paper and it was about ostensibly it was about judicial elections in Arkansas. And so I was doing some research. And just as an aside, I ended up finding about this episode called the Brooks-Baxter War, where you had a disputed election and two people claimed to be governor of Arkansas, and they both raised militias and they ended up killing each other in the streets over it. And that started getting my attention where I thought, oh, I wonder if there's some more here. And so over the years, I've done a lot more research on this. And part of that research revealed something very interesting, which is that before the US Constitution, actually, there were state constitutions. And so before I took state constitutional law in law school, I actually am going to admit something I probably shouldn't admit as a law professor, which is I had not read my state constitution before that class. And I didn't know that state constitutions came before the federal constitution. And so what I realized is that if you're going to understand American constitutional law, quote unquote, then you have to really try to understand these state constitutions because they came before the US Constitution and they inspired key elements of the US Constitution. So to give you just one example, the original text of the US Constitution has no Bill of Rights. And people are objecting left and right. Thomas Jefferson is objecting to this. He writes James Madison a letter saying, hey, you guys did okay on this draft of the Constitution. I have some criticisms of it. Maybe you guys could do it better next time. And people across the political spectrum are saying, I want a Bill of Rights before I'll agree to ratify this. And where is part of that coming from? Part of it's coming from their experience with England, where they feel like they had rights disrespected. But part of it is because since 1776, state constitutions tended to have bills of rights, whether that was religious freedom, whether that was the right to a jury trial, whether that was a right to habeas corpus. They tended to have these declarations of rights. And so Americans in 1787, who had gotten used to reading state constitutions for the past 10 years, seeing bills of rights, they look at the US Constitution and they're literally saying, what's this? What do you mean? Where are my rights at? And so I think that state constitutions really have played such an influential role in shaping even the US Constitution.
How did these constitutions start to break up as the Civil War becomes this major inflection point's not even the word for it?
I think what's happening as the Civil War progresses is you have unresolved tensions from the founding that are starting to cause a lot of chaos and disorder. And so at the founding, you actually had states that were divided on how they treated race and slavery. So, for example, many states openly guaranteed slavery, or, for example, in some states, they actually made owning slaves a way that you could prove a property ownership requirement to vote. So if you owned a certain number of slaves, you could vote. And other states abolished slavery. So, for example, in Vermont, they abolished slavery in the text of their constitution. They invoke a gradual emancipation plan. And then in Massachusetts, they shortly abolish it by court decision interpreting the phrase, all men are born free and independent, or some derivation of that language. And so one of the interesting things that you have as we get to the Civil War is what happens if you have Massachusetts Puritans who have abolished slavery and Alabama and Georgia slaveholders all settle the same state with their conflicting constitutional visions. That's bleeding Kansas. where you have a state that is settled by many Southerners who are used to state constitutions that protect slavery, and then by Midwesterners and Northerners who are used to state constitutions that prohibit slavery, and at least in some cases actually allow black men to vote. By the way, I should say, even in 1787, that was true. There were state constitutions that allowed black men to vote. And in fact, there were black men that voted on ratification of the Constitution, the US Constitution. And so you have what I'm going to call a culture war in Kansas over the biggest culture war issue in American history, which is slavery. And that happens because you can't reconcile slavery. That is an identity conflict about whether we allow slavery or we don't allow slavery, and there's no good compromise to that. In other words, there are some issues I think that are susceptible to compromise, like what are our tax rates going to be, or how much representation in the House does each state get. But is a black person a human being or not a human being? That doesn't work in Kansas, and people start getting into open conflict over their conflicting constitutional visions to the point where they literally organize themselves into armies and start shooting at each other. And that's just a few years before the Civil War. And so you can tell from Kansas's inability to write a state constitution that people agree on and get admitted to the Union that we're in trouble as a country because people are pouring in from different states. So I think Kansas and their conflict over slavery is one of the things that really tells you the American constitutional project is in deep trouble.
It's so interesting. We often go to Kansas in this country's history to see which way things are leaning and headed. Very interesting. You're a lawyer by trade. How did that help you make an argument in book form?
So I think I have an interesting perspective on this as somebody who is a scholar of constitutions, both the state and the federal level, and as a lawyer, because one of the things you realize is that there are some real technical legal issues that are embedded whenever you study constitutional crisis. So let me just give you an example of that. In one of my chapters, I end up talking about a contested election in Arkansas, and you have this issue where what is called a quo warranto petition is filed, and that is essentially a lawsuit where somebody can argue that you don't have proper legal title to an office. And so, to make that kind of concrete for your listeners, I want you to imagine something that's just completely ridiculous, which is that you had a mischievous teenager sneak into the governor's mansion and start signing legislation, pretending that they're governor and stamping the gubernatorial seal on legislation. Your common sense would probably tell listeners that, okay, they have said they're governor, but they don't actually have good title to that office. And so whatever they do is null and void. And so that is what a quo warranto petition allows us to do. It allows us to oust people from office who don't actually belong there. And so that is actually a body of law that has been well developed in a sense over the centuries. And I think being a lawyer helped me to engage with that in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do without legal training. And one of the things I try to do in the book is I try to translate and try to explain concepts like that to people that don't have legal training, because I want people who are non-lawyers to be able to take something from this book as well.
Had you always had a goal to, and you know, you have such an interesting career. You were a clerk for a federal judge. You went into private practice. Now you're a professor. Had the idea of writing a book always been sort of sitting there in your mind?
Yes, I think since 2013, I always had at the back of my mind this insight, which is constitutional crisis happens at the state level, and it's also been something that's been common in American history. So I think I've always in the back of my mind wanted to tell this story in some way or another. And I think the events of the last several years have made it more relevant than ever, which is to say that most Americans now are worried about constitutional crisis in a way that they weren't in 2013. So, in other words, in 2013, when I first get interested in this topic, people just aren't going around saying that they're worried about constitutional crisis or they think our country is in serious trouble. We have very serious disagreements about Obamacare, about gay marriage, as you remember, about all sorts of issues, but you just don't hear people saying we're in a constitutional crisis. Um, but we are now.
It's
Uh,
well, my next question, I just, as I was going through preparing for this episode, I started writing down moments that could have been seen as a constitutional crisis just in the last 20 years or so. Well, I hate to say now it's 30 years for me. Um, uh, just start with the impeachment of Bill Clinton, the 2000 election, the Iraq War, in which a military operation proceeded without Congress officially declaring. Well, of course, there was a so-called authorization vote, but it was not an official declaration of war. The passage of Obamacare, which you mentioned, which turned some of the people against someone who they argued was a tyrant. We have January 6th, and I also was just thinking about it yesterday. I believe was the when we taped this episode, the day before was the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, which was an attempt to strike at federal power, which was a strike against federal power. How has witnessing all of that impacted your studies and impacted your thesis?
uh, yes, and we could add 9/11 into that.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely true. And so, just in my life, I have seen a lot of difficult moments for this country. And one of the things that those do, I think, is they help illustrate what is a real constitutional crisis and which maybe isn't. And I should say that I think it's true that in a lot of ways, it's easiest to tell whether we're in a constitutional crisis in retrospect when you know what comes
Yeah.
after.
Yeah.
However, one of the things that all of these events teach me is that we can deal with tension and strain and strong rhetoric and some level of violence, even, and come out on the other side. So, for instance, Oklahoma City bombing, school shootings, 9/11, all of these have been traumatic events that have not resulted in the end of our constitutional order. And so what that does is I think that makes me what I'm going to call a more even-keeled observer of constitutional crisis. I think that there is a temptation that whenever there looks like a serious problem, that people can jump to, well, are we in a constitutional crisis? And the fact that we have survived so many difficult moments that I, in retrospect, probably wouldn't classify as constitutional crises, makes it so that I'm less jumpy as I approach this topic, and that I'm uh, less willing to just sling the term constitutional crisis around.
One of the things that your book argues is that there are six major inflection points. You've mentioned a couple of them to this point. Are there any others that you want to make sure to highlight during this interview that you think really illustrate the idea that we have a constitutional order that is drawing on these violent incidents?
Sure. I'll talk about two very quickly. One is the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island. And what's going on there is you
And
have
what and about when is that and what year?
it is in 1842, 1841 in Rhode Island. And what's going on in Rhode Island is for many, many years, people have been trying to change the property requirements to be able to vote. And so back then, Rhode Island says that you have to have a certain amount of wealth to be able to vote. And people don't like that. And people actually cite even the Declaration of Independence. If all men are created equal, then how can it be that if I don't have a certain amount of money, I can't vote? And so people petition to change that for many, many years, and it falls on deaf ears. And so ultimately, what happens is Rhode Islanders who want to extend voting rights end up holding their own legally unsanctioned constitutional convention. And then they write that constitution they stage an unofficial ratification vote, but a vote that suggests that a majority of Rhode Island voters actually support extending suffrage rights. And when that constitution is not recognized, they raise a militia to implement it by force. And This is called the Rhode Island question. People are seriously wondering in 1842 whether we're on the brink of civil war or not. So why is this such an inflection point? It becomes an inflection point in American history because both Thomas Dorr, who is elected governor under what's called the People's Constitution, and then Samuel Ward King, who is the governor under Rhode Island's official government, they both appeal for federal support. And so they both try to get the federal government to intervene on their side. And eventually, there is a court case down the road called Luther versus Borden. And that starts a trend of the US Supreme Court saying that the guarantee clause of the US Constitution is a political question. So let me say a word about that. One of the provisions of the US Constitution that's not as well known is one in Article 4 that says that the US Constitution guarantees to the states a Republican form of government. And as you can probably imagine, what counts as a Republican form of government has been something that has been contested over the years. And the Supreme Court says that essentially courts don't have a role in deciding whether or not there is a Republican form of government. And that starts with Luther versus Borden, and then it continues with a case I mentioned out of Kentucky in 1900, where there's another contested election. And so that's important because I argue in the book that the guarantee clause could be a tool for courts to fight things like partisan gerrymandering. And so I ask a question, how do we have a government that's Republican in form if you have maps that are distorted by extreme partisan gerrymandering? And courts have said that they do not have a role in policing partisan gerrymandering. And one of the things they fail to fully appreciate is that that in part comes from concerns related to the Dorr Rebellion. The Supreme Court didn't want to try to take sides over which was the proper government of Rhode Island. So that's something that has affected Supreme Court case law today. And then the second version I'll give you is South Carolina during Reconstruction, where white supremacists overthrow a majority Republican government, and they're able to overthrow a constitution that was the first constitutional convention that was majority black in America. So actually about half of them were slaves, and a majority of them were black who wrote the 1868 South Carolina Constitution to get readmitted to the Union. And white supremacists waged a campaign for almost a decade to overthrow this. And to do so, they engage in voter fraud. There actually are reports of some white supremacists voting 20 times in one day in an election. And so they'd get on horse parties and gallop from pole to vote. And then they also would appear at polling places with guns, and they would tell Black Republicans, hey, if you vote, we're going to kill you. And so they're able to actually suppress enough votes to get an election dispute. And at the end of the day, they are able to take control of South Carolina's government. Why does this such an inflection point? It shows the rest of the nation just how determined white supremacists are to defeat anything related to racial equality. And it's going to be another century before we get Brown versus Board of Education, before we get civil rights acts of the 1960s. And so seeing the lengths that those southern states were willing to go to overthrow the government really had very dramatic consequences. The last of which I'll mention here, which is that those consequences are present in the text of some of these state constitutions. So in South Carolina, today the state constitution still does not ban slavery in 2025.
That is crazy. I was going to ask you that exact question if they ever went and rewrote it. And I guess the answer is no.
No. So in 1895, they call a constitutional convention in South Carolina with the explicit purpose of trying to disenfranchise blacks across the state. And they do a few things that you can still see in the text. One is a literacy test. If you read the South Carolina Constitution, you will still find a literacy test in the text of the state constitution, not enforced today. but still in the text. They got rid of language banning slavery in South Carolina's Constitution. And then they even got rid of language that repudiated secession. So that was almost kind of a screw you to the federal government in 1895 of we're not even going to abide by our prior constitutional provision that said we repudiate secession. And here's why I think that is relevant for today. Yes, that's interesting historically. One of the things I say in the book is why would a Black South Carolinian respect the South Carolina Constitution? In other words, if you gave a Black South Carolinian the text of the South Carolina Constitution and they saw that it doesn't abolish slavery, there's a literacy test, it won't declare that all men are created equal, would they respect the South Carolina Constitution or not? And so some of these incidents, I think, are really resulting in constitutions that are themselves, I hate to put it this way, unworthy of respect by modern Americans.
And it certainly, um, I hadn't thought of this till just now, but it certainly highlights the church shooting that happened during the Obama administration, I think 2015. Isn't that an interesting moment to think about in the context of what you're saying here about South Carolina? As you came across, as you wrote this book and came across different characters, is there a particular hero who you'd like to highlight as somebody who not only fought for the Constitution, but fought for what's right?
Yes, I think there are heroes in the constitutional story, and what I'm going to say is I think they're complicated heroes, which in some ways makes them more relatable to us. So I'll give you one right now, who's Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens actually appears in my first constitutional crisis in Pennsylvania, and he ends up as a congressman, really being a crusader for racial equality. He plays important roles in Reconstruction, and he even actually chooses to be buried in a cemetery. And as a sign of protest, he actually puts up a sign that says, I choose to be buried here in this secluded spot because I didn't want to be in a segregated cemetery. So, what a last statement to make with your life. And so that's somebody who I think you would clearly see as a man who fought for justice and was on the right side of history. Why do I say he's complicated? Well, it turns out that he may have tried to steal an election earlier on in his career. So in 1838, during the Buckshot War, he was a member of the Whig Party before the Republican Party was formed. And he played a role in some machinations for the Whigs to be able to get a majority in the state House of Representatives, even though there were some shenanigans that went on in that election. And I raise that because I just think, isn't it interesting that even people that are heroes have these moments where maybe they're not so admirable? And instead of losing respect for people, that actually teaches me that maybe we need to recognize that all of us are fallible and all of us have moments that are not so great. And that makes him more relatable to me.
Who among us doesn't have a mixed record, right? Um, uh, if Professor Gadson was Lord Gadson, was King Gadson, and I gave you a Sharpie marker to make your own amendment to the Constitution to make it A, stronger and B, more just, what would your amendment be?
So maybe we'll start with the U.S. Constitution. So first of all, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of emperors and kings.
Yeah, but this is my show, so
It's
hey,
your show,
yeah,
so
I've
you get
given
to
you the
have
marker. I've given you the magic marker.
you get to do that on your show. I actually think I would change Article 5. And Article 5 of the Constitution is about amendments to the Constitution. And amending the Constitution is incredibly difficult. You need two-thirds of both houses of Congress to propose an amendment and three-quarters of states to ratify. And because we live in such a hyper-partisan era, it's just impossible to
Yeah,
imagine
not
we
gonna
get that
happen. Yeah,
far.
yeah.
And even Justice Scalia said that he thought that that was a bit much. So I would change Article 5, and I would change it to make it easier in some way for people to amend the Constitution, but still I would want it to be balanced where it's not too easy. So I definitely think it's important that you can't just amend the Constitution on a whim. But I do think it should be a little bit easier because then we could make some changes that would help us better confront modern challenges and modern life.
What parts of the Constitution are most effective that have stood the test of time?
I think what has most effectively stood the test of time, I think the Bill of Rights. Uh, I think the idea of being able to have religious liberty, being able to advocate on behalf of particular candidates, I just think that that is an incredible freedom we have in America that too many Americans don't appreciate. And one of the things I tell my students when I teach constitutional law is a lot of you take the First Amendment, just to give one example, for granted. But if you lived in Russia or China or Iran, you would not take those for granted. So I think that that has been extraordinarily successful. And I just want to say I think that's a tribute to our founding fathers that they were able to give us a Bill of Rights that still speaks to us today in 2025.
I have the advanced reader copy of the book, so I'm not sure if this is in the final book. I want to know, did you dedicate this book to somebody? It's not in the advanced reader copy. So is there a dedication? And if not, who would you like to spiritually dedicate this book to?
There is not a specific dedication, but here's who I will dedicate it to on this podcast. I will actually dedicate it to my students because they are going to be in a position where the Constitution I teach them about will be theirs. And I hope that they will learn the lessons from this book and try to continue the task of making us a better country.
Marcus Gadson, the author of Sedition: How America's Constitutional Order Emerged from Violent Crisis. Thank you so much for being here.
It was great to be on.
Check out the book and his social media feed on the website formerly known as Twitter at Marcus A. Gadson. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.